The format has been that the speakers introduce themselves for 4 or 5 minutes, and then each of the tables gets together and decides how they're best going to exploit these people for the ends of the workshop, and then to feed that back into the affinity group in the next session. Now, the point of this workshop is overall narrative and meta-messaging, and how we essentially tell the biggest stories, the deepest stories, that give some context to all of the crazy news that's coming out, so people have some sense that they understand the dynamics of their period in history and how they may be able to insert themselves into it. So the particular workshop this morning is framing dangerous news and investigative findings in ways that motivate rather than terrify or induce apathy or denial or more drug habits. So this is a major thing about messaging, as you know, because everybody who has dealt with election fraud or 9/11 or a lot of the torture stories, you have people that get initially intellectually interested, and then they start to see the implications of what it means for the system, what it means for the media, what it means for the whole country, and then they back away because they just don't have the time or nerve to stand up to all of that realization. We have to figure out how to do that, and that's what the discussion is about today. And so we've been operating without introductions, only self-introductions, and so shall begin. Bob, why don't you 5 minutes and say who you is. You can do it from the table if you want, either way. Yeah, doesn't matter. Stand. Okay. Go use a mic. I've been holding your hands.
All right. Let's see. This is fine. I'm Bob Fitrakis, and I have the privilege of being here with Cynthia McKinney because my plane was delayed. But my background, if I can be of a resource, I have a PhD in political science, which means, according to the mainstream media, I know absolutely nothing about politics or elections. In fact, the Columbus Dispatch, for the first 20 years of my career, as I rose from an instructor to a full professor at Columbus State, they referred to me as a, quote, activist. Having originally been from Detroit, I thought that was positive, and then I realized I was in Columbus, Ohio, and it had different implications. So I also have a JD from the Moritz College of Law at The Ohio State University, and my first case that I did was I sued Ohio State as soon as I graduated because they had, and I won in Columbus, Ohio. I sued them because they canceled the hemp festival because it coincided with Parents' Day. But I knew, I reminded them there was this thing called the First Amendment, and since I had all their email through public records request, I knew I would win that case. They didn't know I had all their email, but I had it. So my most recent case is, well, I got a couple cases going on. A black man was attacked by 10 neo-Nazis in Columbus, Ohio, and being held on $500,000 bond, except the Nazis seemed to like, MySpace and brag about wanting to kill black people, which I took to the judge and got him out on a $750 bond. I also did an impeach Bush case in the city of Kent. You may know it, where Kent State is that a man was facing 6 months for littering for putting an impeach Bush sign in the park. But we took pictures of the military signs offering $30,000 bonuses and 2 people on the city council signs for their real estate businesses, and they reconsidered, backed down, apologized, and changed the law. So I've been active on a, on a legal front. I also, more importantly, I published the Columbus Free Press. And if you can go online at freepress.org, I think the cover story in this issue showing the rise of the ties between the CIA and the electronic voting forces could be one of the most important that we've ever written. Although I know Cynthia reminded me the last time I saw her the fact that they outsourced the vote count from Ohio for an hour on election night to Chattanooga, Tennessee, to the old Pioneer Bank building just when that unexpected vote flip occurred. It was probably an important story as well. And again, I have a variety of books out. I'm an investigative journalist. I've won 11 mainstream awards, primarily because nobody does it, so I'm competing against myself in Ohio. We got 4 from Bob. Maybe he'll win. And latest book I have out is What Happened in Ohio, New Press, a documentary history of theft and fraud. And I'm working on 2 more, one on the rise of electronic voting, and one sort of the greatest hits of Bob and Harvey, my co-conspirator, Harvey Wasserman. I'm kind of the, Harvey's wonderful. I like to think of myself as the Len, and I do the content research, and Harvey writes all the prose and lyrics, and of course, Harvey incredibly articulate. But this is the book I have. Also, I've run as a independent candidate for governor of Ohio. I actually ran as a congressman, and I've been on the I was a Democratic political operative and quite successful. Back in the early 90s. I only apologize somewhat for that. I did elect some good people. And too bad Cynthia wasn't in my area. And now could be governor of the state. We'll have to try and draft her. But so I've done politics. I've actually been a ward person. And probably more importantly, I was the election protection attorney in the inner city during the incredible vanishing machines in 2004, and I could count past 2. So that's what I've done, and I'm glad to be a resource for you here today.
Hi. So, well, I'm Cynthia McKinney, and I'm in an unusual predicament, and that is that it's not my voice, because my voice is your voice, but it's my vocal cords, okay? I understand that the subject matter today is framing. Okay, I understand that the subject matter today is framing dangerous news. I think y'all got to figure out a way to frame me, because I am about the most dangerous news that these folks have seen in a very long time. I was trying to just write down a list of the things that I was working on when I was in the Congress. And of course, there was the whole issue of Barrett Gold. There was the Rwanda genocide. Now, the situation with Barrett Gold, that's Bush. That's a direct Bush connection. Bush, Andrew Young, Vernon Jordan, all of the people that we are told we need to look up to, doing horrible, dastardly things on the African continent and probably elsewhere. I was working with Greg Palast, a wonderful investigative journalist, to bring truth and justice to the folks at Barrett Gold who are using your tax dollars in order to inflict human rights abuses across the African continent. The Rwanda genocide, everything that you think you know about the 1 million souls that were killed, that perished in what we now know as the Rwanda genocide, is not the truth. The bottom line is that it was a regime change fashioned in Washington, D.C. And because of that regime change, folks in the highest offices, not only in Washington, but also in New York at the United Nations, were willing to see at least 500,000 souls perish, as that's what the CIA report said. And it didn't matter, because the objective to secure certain mineral resources for corporations, mainly U.S. corporations, but also Western corporations, was more important than saving human lives. Blood diamonds in Sierra Leone, we worked on that issue. and of course worked tirelessly to try and get Madeleine Albright to do the right thing and to name as terrorist organizations organizations that were in fact wreaking terror across the African continent. But it didn't work because there were high powers roaming the halls in Washington, D.C., like, for example, Maurice Templeman, who was behind the Revolutionary United Front that was chopping off the hands of little boys and raping little girls. And because of his involvement with the Revolutionary United Front, as found by the United Nations and sandline troops that went into Foday Sanko's home, found a letter from Maurice Templeman saying, we can do business together. Of course, the issue of Tamiflu. How is it that the Pentagon could buy $60 million worth of Tamiflu at the time that Donald Rumsfeld is the Secretary of the Pentagon, and nobody asked any questions about conflict of interest when Donald Rumsfeld owned stock in the Tamiflu Corporation, aside from the fact that Tamiflu isn't even effective against additional strains of bird flu. So, and governments around the world and states across our country have purchased Tamiflu. And then, of course, election integrity. The work that Bob has done on election integrity is absolutely incredible. You can see it in the film American Blackout, where he tells us what happened in Ohio in 2004. But what's wrong with our country? Perhaps the most dangerous framing that you guys can help with is, how can we have 2 presidential elections stolen from the American people, and the American people don't even know about it, and then when those that do aren't outraged about it? How can this happen in our country? I guess the same way that I was sitting down with Immortal Technique, and he was also asking the question about the American people sitting on an airplane for 17 hours and not doing anything. I don't know if you saw what happened in Argentina when folks had little problem with their flights, and they erupted in riots at the airport, and Americans sat for 17 hours. The reason I can't talk is I sat docilely for 5 hours on a plane, and so now I can't talk 5 hours on the tarmac. But at any rate, what's happened in our country, to the extent that you guys can help people who are actually doing the hard work, the heavy lifting, to share, so to protect us from the onslaught that comes from the corporate media when we ask questions that the American people deserve answers for. And I see Ray McGovern out here in the audience. We've got heroes here in this audience. Peter Dale Scott, who is going to be my advisor as I work at University of California on my PhD, so I can be like Bob here. But we have so much to protect in our country, and I don't understand what is happening and how it's happening, that people in Haiti can find 86,000 blank ballots and they can take to the streets and they can save their democracy. And we can have 2 stolen presidential elections, and we don't do what it takes in order to save the republic that we have. This is it as far as I'm concerned. 2008 is it. If we don't take Mario Savio's admonition to us and stop the machine with our entire bodies, if we don't do that, the consolidation of power will be so great by 2012. What is it that we will be able to do? I shouldn't bother you more with my broken voice.
The spokesperson from each table, if you'll come up here. Well, if you come up and kind of line up, then we don't have to wait for each person to come up. And we can start.
Using this or this?
You,
Okay. Am I on? All right. Question is, there was a ruling in the California Supreme Court on December 24th that states that malls, privately owned malls, are public spaces open to free speech just the same as a street. Unless they are charging an entrance fee to go in the mall, then we can take our signs in, we can take our flyers, we can do everything that we would normally do on the street. The only stipulation is that you cannot interrupt reasonable operations of the mall. Like you can't block entrances, you can't block escalators, you have to be there during business hours. We took advantage of this law on the 11th of this month, and we really had to fight our asses off not to get arrested. We did get thrown off the property, and the police supported that, but we showed them the law, and they said it's new. How do we exercise our free speech rights in a mall, according to the law, privately owned, without having to defend ourselves in court? Is there a way that we can prepare? Is there a lawyer that we can have on hand that will defend us? What can we do? You want to see it?
First of all, as somebody who's been arrested in mall, and so is my wife, on the sweatshop issues, the law wasn't on our side at the time, is that malls had developed under various doctrines to being private entities. We had argued in court on various occasions because public money went into them. They were in the new town halls and town centers, but we had lost that argument. So this is a very important case. Number one is, in my long association with the police, I found we haven't done a good job of training our police as foot soldiers of the Constitution. Although we do have high standards in Columbus, you must have a GED. But, well, which is better? I came from Detroit. You had to be 6 foot, 200 pounds, and beat up hippies and black people. So we've advanced somewhat. But I think you've got to absolutely have this case with you, and it would help to have a lawyer go there. I've always found that police act better when they're approached by lawyers who inform them politely of the rights of individuals, and I would not rely on the police knowledge of new laws. Not that they're not going to understand it in 2 or 3 years. But when you're being maced and beaten initially, that's not going to help you that the law is on your side. And when they invoke sovereign immunity and hit you with the DORA charges, the standard disorderly conduct, obstructing official business, resisting arrest, and the felony charge that is always thrown in, assaulting a police officer when your head hits their billy club. That's so they can plead down to the misdemeanors. It's not going to do you much good. So I'd recommend that you have these cases with you and you have an attorney, and that you, as you initially break the malls in to the law, and I would congratulate the state of California for taking this step with this ruling.
The only thing I would say, as one who has had to campaign in malls, is that you take the proactive stance of getting to know the mall management and informing them of what your rights are, so that you don't have the meeting of the head in the billy club. And we would always serve notice that we were going to be in a certain place, and it always worked very well for us, even in Georgia, where such a ruling would be highly unlikely.
So I'm an attorney, Katie, and I've got a memo on the Pruneyard case, and I know Tony Bird's been trying to get a hold of it. I'd be glad to send it to you. It's about free speech and protest. I haven't read the case you're talking about. I I know, I just haven't had a chance to read it, but let's talk about it. If you need an attorney to dress up in a suit and be there, a lot of this is just common sense and sort of scripting a lawsuit scenario for them so that they are on notice that they might actually have to deal with litigation. And you just have to be, firm, and you have to be prepared and just organized. So anyway, we can talk further about that later. I have a question for you, Cynthia. I'm running for Board of Supervisors in, if I can get the money, in Yvonne Burke's district in Los Angeles. And I was at the Martin Luther King parade. And the people at our table, a lot of us were at the MLK parades recently with anti-war and impeach signs. And what we're realizing, and if you look at the demographics here today, is the disconnect today with the anti-war impeach movement and the class dynamics within the Hispanic and African American communities is far more pronounced than it was during the late 60s, early 70s. How do we here today tap and channel the energy, the real working class energy of the 2.2 million African Americans in the 2nd District in LA County, Inglewood, Carson, Compton, where the per capita income is like $15,000 per year? You know, I've been shocked to discover recently. How do we get that done, and how do we do it quickly in time? You're right, we're running out of time. It's 2008. How do we get those people to switch away from the Democratic Party machine, which is lined up behind Bernie Parks, you know, and conservative Democrats, to people like you and Cindy Sheehan? How do we make them? How do we get them to join our movement and create common cause with them the way the activists did in the late 60s and early 70s?
That really is like the fundamental question. And I'm hopeful that the work that I'm doing with the Green Party and making a public split with the Democrats in terms of the space that they allow people like me who want to tell the truth, who have a conscience, who think that values, the true American values, ought to be reflected in our public policy. There ought to be room for people like us, but we see that there was no room for Dennis Kucinich. There was no room for Mike Gravel. And so I think the ultimate message then has to be taken into the Black community and the Latino community of a platform, the issues that you stand for. And you can't just think that by having them on a piece of paper that the community is going to receive it. The people who are also delivering the message have to have credibility inside the community. And it can't be the first time that they've gone into here you are, that you've gone into the community and tried to forge these relationships. So first is message. You've got to have the right message through your platform. Secondly, you've got to have the right people delivering your message on your behalf, you as well as people from the community delivering your message. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, is the coalitions that you're able to make inside the community, and you've got to go where the community is. They won't come to you. So if your voting demographic is 16 to 35-year-old, 18 to 35-year-olds, yes, I do support lowering the voting age, then you've got to go where they are. And sometimes that means going into places that you've never been before, but you're going to offer them something that they've never had before. Well, just as an example, I campaigned in clubs. In my very, very first campaign, I was in the clubs. I would come home at like 5 o'clock in the morning, and my mother thought that I was out partying, but I was actually campaigning.
An investigative report.
Our question is pretty simple. We were talking about how we are continually engaged in dialogue with other people who have maybe not done the research that we've done. And so what we were hoping to ask you is for practical suggestions for how to motivate people out of their comfort zone without scaring them into despondency.
I thought you guys were supposed to answer that question.
Yeah. Well, I've spent close to 30 years now teaching social problems, despondency. Amazingly enough, and we know it probably better than everyone else, virtually everything we look at, there's actual solutions to. So my suggestion is, when we outline the problem, in the articles when we talk to people, is it can't be, it's not insurmountable. It's the rest of the world has figured out universal health care. We're the freaks. In terms of this, is we can't figure it out. Is that everyone else? Even Canada figured it out. In the 1960s, so when we look at these things, is that I think we have to offer an array of solutions, and people need, I think, to be hammered with the facts and also hampered, with simple solutions. 95% of the world counts on paper ballots. I was the international election observer in El Salvador in 1994. I went to the conflictive zone. Why? Because it was the conflictive zone in between the guerrillas and the death squads. I wrote the International Observer Report. These people hadn't had an election very quickly, within 3 hours. Far more people than in any precinct in the United States. They counted the votes by hand in front of the UN, in front of the international election observers, and in front of the media. Is that there's solutions to all these problems, and and we got to point it out. Is that look, if you got 4% of the world's population and you're spending now close to $700 billion on the military, most people can understand a map. I get out a map and say, look, I know we're in big trouble. We have 2 oceans on either side of us, and a friendly Mexico and a friendly Canada to the north. Exactly why do we need this much money? And that most people realize that when you point out where we are in the world and they actually see it, that we don't. And that once they understand that we don't, they're willing to change.
This is really interesting, and you talk about framing, because I like to do the statistics, and in my remarks, I like to inform Black America of the true state of Black America, because, of course, they don't know. They're looking at television and looking at the WB and UPN or whatever, and they're laughing, and, there's no one actually informing them of their misery that they're living. So, I was doing a thing on life expectancy, and the mainstream media said life expectancy in the United States is the highest it's ever been. And that was the headline. But what they didn't tell us, that we were like 42nd in the world. They didn't tell us that. So I think Bob is right. At least provide the flip side. When you're writing on an issue, provide that additional bit of information that's not being provided by the what I don't even like to call them mainstream, because they're losing subscriptions and everything else. The other thing is on infant mortality. You look at, everybody seems to have gotten it right. The so-called socialized medicine countries, Canada, UK, Europe, their statistics are all better than ours. And in fact, there was one headline that I think was particularly interesting and important for us to understand just exactly how